Society Matters.
Hello, everyone. I'm Donna Rosenblum, your host of Legacy Chronicles, Honoring the Past. And I am here with a good friend. I'm so excited that she has traveled all the way from Philadelphia to come today, Elaine Culbertson, who is an extraordinary person. And that is saying the minimal. You know that. So Elaine has a book that she has published about her life history and her relationship with her parents and growing up as a second-generation Holocaust survivor. So we're going to first of all, welcome. Thank you for coming to our wonderful hmTV podcast studio and being on today. And let's just go back and kind of briefly talk about your parents. How did they survive? Where were they? Just fill us in on that.
I just have to say how excited I am to see Donna. This is a long-term friendship that goes back many years. She was still in the cradle, I think.
I was a baby.
So my parents, both of my parents were from Poland, from very different parts of Poland, and they met after the war. But their war trajectory pretty much traces what happened to many Jews in Poland. My mother was from a small town that's now in Belarus. Mm-hmm. Her town ended up first being ghettoized and then deported to Auschwitz in late January, the beginning of February 1943. My mom was the only member of her immediate family to survive. She lost her father, who jumped from the train on the way to Auschwitz. She lost her mother and her younger siblings probably on the first day that they arrived in Auschwitz, because my grandmother and the younger children were probably selected for death immediately.
Went to the left.
Yes. And she lost her sister a couple of months in, because both my mother and her sister were chosen to work. And her sister was killed while out on a, while out on a job.
Right.
My father is from southeastern Poland, now in Ukraine. And he survived with his brother. They ended up in Plaszow and then in Mauthausen. They had some extraordinary experience as well, but in the book I chose to focus on my mother, because those were the stories I think that really pierced me and influenced me in a lot of different ways. Yeah. So they met after the war in the Polish city of Lodz. Two brothers married two best friends, and with the intent of possibly emigrating to what was first Palestine, then Israel, but they ended up both families coming to America.
Right. And both settled in Brooklyn, or just your parents?
Just my parents settled in Brooklyn, because my mother had two uncles. My grandmother's brothers had come to America before the war.
Right.
Both of them were unmarried, and things were starting to look not so good in Europe, and they came to the United States. My grandmother was already married, having children. Things in my grandfather's eyes must have seemed okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so both of your parents, did they talk about the Holocaust right from so it's you and your brother in your family?
Yes.
Were they open about being survivors? I know that you spoke Yiddish in the house, that Yiddish was spoken as well as English and Polish. Like, at what age did you kind of get the inkling that your parents are a little different than some of your friends' parents, and that there's something here that has a lot? There's a lot going on here.
There's a lot here.
Yeah.
I knew very early on, I was very aware of the difference between inside the house and outside the house. So inside the house, everyone is speaking Yiddish. Outside the house, on the streets of Brooklyn, everybody is speaking English. So right away, I'm becoming bilingual. Inside the house, my parents' friends are predominantly other Holocaust survivors. Outside of the house, my father is out working in Manhattan, and my mother is at home with us. And it's a very different existence. There's a pull between America and what is going on inside of our house, which is a different version of America.
Right.
I think one of my first inklings that something was up was this use of the Yiddish word milchama, which means war. And the fact that that was sprinkled into every conversation that my parents were having with their friends. And the number on my mother's arm. So because my mother was in Auschwitz, she was tattooed. I was kind of scared of that number. Most people didn't have tattoos in those days, particularly women didn't have tattoos. And when I asked my mother what that was, and I think I was about 3, my mother told me it was her phone number, which scared me to death because I thought that if I didn't know our phone number, the phone company would come and do that to me. Wow. And it's not a pretty tattoo. Yeah. It's kind of rough, just numbers. And so I memorized our phone number, which unfortunately is still seared in my mind, Evergreen 58712. And it kind of went from there.
Yeah. So being in a house where your parents did speak openly, again, I do this Legacy Chronicles with many 2Gs, and everyone's story is a little different and, follows a different path. Can you maybe highlight 2 or 3 things about your upbringing that really were so different? So I'll give you an example. We have Dr. Bernie Fershpan, who is on our board, who is on our executive board. He just had a documentary done. And he talks about how his parents, whenever they would enter a room, would immediately look for the exits. They always had like a game plan, an exit strategy. They always had like a bag packed in case they had to leave in the middle of the night. And he didn't realize that that was bizarre until he was a little bit older.
I didn't experience that, but I will say this. I always felt like the ambassador to America from my parents, that I was explaining things to them, the way things were done, the way school ran. It was very often a kind of struggle to get them to see that what I was telling them was the way it had to be. And I'll give you an example. When I was about 6 and a half, we moved to Philadelphia from Brooklyn, and my father had the chance to purchase a shoe store. And because that had been his dad's business in Europe, shoes and making shoes, and what saved him in the camps, the ability to make shoes, he wanted the chance to really make a good living. So we moved to Philadelphia. And I remember that I was pestering my parents to allow me to buy an instrument at school so I could be in the school orchestra. And it was a kind of small, I will call it like a xylophone that came in a box. And was probably just 1 octave or an octave and a half, and you used a little wooden hammer to play out the tune. And if you were in this orchestra, you could sit at the front of the auditorium or on the stage and accompany the students as they sang. And I wanted desperately to be involved in this. It cost $8, which in the 1950s was a lot of money. And so I worked on my parents for 2 weeks about this. And when it came time to bring the money to school, my father gave me a 5 3/1, and he wrapped it in my hand. And I said, "Daddy, I need to have an envelope." And he said, "This country wastes so much if I give you the envelope, what are they going to do with it? They're just going to throw it out. You can hold the money in your hand. There was no arguing with him. So I closed my fist around these bills, and I walked to school thinking, the teacher will take the money right away. But she didn't.
Right.
So I sat at my desk with my left hand closed around this money, waiting for her to call on us. And finally, probably 2 hours into the class, she said, all right, we're going to collect the money for the bells. That's what they called them. And she finally called on me. When I came up to her desk to hand her the money, I couldn't open my fist. The money was wet from me sweating all over it, afraid that I would lose it. And the teacher said in a very loud voice, Elaine, when we bring money to school, we bring it in an envelope with our name on the front. And I thought, not only does everyone in my class hear this, but the entire world hears her speaking. I could feel my cheeks burning, and I kind of slunked back to my desk and thought, when I go home, I'm going to tell my father. And when I told him, and I thought he would relent right away and say, well, of course, next time you can have an envelope. He said to me, did you give her the money? Yes. Then what's the problem? Well, after that, I stole envelopes from my father's, from the business part of his
right, so you wouldn't
of the shoe store.
So you wouldn't have to ever ask.
So I wouldn't have to ask. And I told my brother, who's 3.5 years younger, I said, don't ever ask Daddy for an envelope. Ask me. And I hid them in my underwear drawer. Now, I know for sure my mother must have found them at some point because she was putting the laundry away. But I think she understood how that was a sort of initiation into what was going on, and how I had to sidestep at times my mother, at times my father, at times both of them, to not feel like the refugee kid.
Right. Yes, and and look, that's a common theme, and one of the reasons why not only survivors but the second generation, I think, is so effective in speaking to young people, or anybody, but particularly for young people. We do have a lot of kids that come from other countries that live here on Long Island, and they all go through this. They have their language at home, they have maybe their more ethnic name, and they want to be American, and and there's this constant, my own family went through that. My mother was a Gutierrez in an Irish neighborhood and learned the Irish jig because she wanted to be like everybody else.
Right.
And she didn't want anything ethnic. She wanted to eat peanut butter and jelly and, whatever.
We didn't even know what that was.
Right. So, a lot of that. And that's a very much a theme that everybody can relate to. Everybody wants to fit in. Everybody wants to. But I remember reading in your book, particularly about not having family.
Yes.
Your grandparents.
Yes.
Not having photographs. Not having the legacy. And it's one of the things that when I lecture to students, I talk about that, where survivors don't have anything. Imagine, I say to kids today, you have your phone. You take pictures of everything. Your life is on that phone. Imagine not having any pictures of aunts or uncles or grandparents or anything.
They're all ghosts to you. You go to something where people sort of remember your family, and they will say things like, oh, you look just like your mother's sister. And you will say, oh, because perhaps the picture that you might have was sent to America in 1930, and it is of your mother's sister when she was 5 or 6 years old.
Right.
And luckily for those 2 uncles who saved those things and gave us that. But I remember in particular as a teenager, when it was time for people's bar and bat mitzvahs, that people were receiving things from their families' legacies. All right. Somebody is getting the tallis that his grandfather owned. Somebody else is getting candlesticks that belonged to her grandmother and were brought from Russia. All of this kind of thing. Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. And I remember my mom saying, you have your Yiddish. That's your legacy. But I also thought, yeah, but I'm not going to be speaking Yiddish to my child, so that's going to evaporate in some ways. And I thought, my legacy is the stories of what happened to them. That's what I'm going to pass on.
Right. So again, perfect segue. Couldn't have asked for a better. Again, in your reading your book about how those stories were so near and dear, how you would hide under the table and listen to the stories in Yiddish until you were allowed to actually sit in the room to hear the survivors' stories. I guess it wasn't something that you consciously made a decision that you were going to be involved in Holocaust education.
No, not until something happened in my classroom. I was an English teacher in Philadelphia in a high school that was predominantly African American. And I was hoping that my students would be able to identify in some ways, but it seemed too long ago and too obscure for them. They really didn't have much of a connection until we worked something out to talk about family, the importance of family, the necessity of finding a means of survival and helping in your family. And I will tell you, the one incident that sort of knocked me out was that several boys were sitting in the back of my classroom during their lunch period, which also happened to be mine. So my classroom was open. And one of them said to the other, and I wasn't supposed to be listening. I was marking papers at my desk, but teachers have antennas. And one of them said to the other, I'm going to buy a leather jacket today after school. I hope I can Jew the guy down. Okay, this is an African-American teenager. This is 1972, 73, somewhere in there. And I hear this and I say, what did you just say? And he said, I'm buying a leather jacket. He's now like hollering to me across the room. I said, no, the other part. He said, I hope I can Jew the guy down. I said, what does that mean? He said to me, you know what that means. It means I'm going to try and get a better price. And I said, so what does it have to do with Jews?
Right.
And he said, well, Jews are cheap. They're always trying to get the best price for something. And I said, do you know any Jews? And he said, no. I said, none? He said, no. So I said, I'm Jewish. He said, you can't be Jewish. You don't have a big nose, and you don't always talk about money.
Wow.
And I thought, these are the same tropes of Nazi Germany that are being spouted in my classroom 30-some years later.
In America.
And this kid doesn't even know
what he's saying,
or that he's being offensive in some way. And he's completely devoid of what he thinks are any connections with Jewish people. So this kind of spurred me on. Of course, what do? You're an English teacher. You go to the book room to look for books for the kids to read. There were 13 copies of the Diary of Anne Frank, kind of paperback, shredded, missing pages. I couldn't really hand those out. I had 33 kids in my class. In each class, because if you're an English teacher, you taught 5 different classes. And so I started typing them up on those purple mimeograph sheets that we used to crank. Okay.
Well, I did that too.
Okay. And so the kids are reading the book and we're talking about it. And then one of them says to me, so what's so bad? She's with her family. They seem to have food to eat. It doesn't really seem so terrible. They're a little uncomfortable. And I said, you realize that they're afraid that at any moment they might be captured or that someone might give them up to be captured. And they said, yeah, but that's not really in the book very much. This is mostly about her relationship with her mother, her sister,
Right, Peter. Right.
Peter. And I thought,
Yeah, this isn't working.
this isn't working. So I wrote a story that reflected my mother's life. And I handed it out. And it set these kids on a completely different path. I didn't tell them at first that it was about my mom. I just told them, this is a kind of a different story, not in a book. And we went from there.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, those types of things, I had a similar experience. You know, I'm not Jewish. Charlie is Jewish. When I first was teaching, I had my maiden name of Orfiero. And when I got married, I didn't take Rosenblum because Mrs. Rosenblum was my mother-in-law, right? You know, I didn't relate. And I remember probably a year or two later, a child raising their hand and saying, you know, Miss A, what's your married name? And I said, oh, my married name is Rosenblum. Oh, now I understand.
Uh-huh.
And I was like mortified that the kid thought that I was embarrassed by a Jewish last name. And, you know, this was early 90s. You know, so these same, and then, you know, and there were other things that happened. My husband's an attorney. There were comments about, oh, you married the Jewish lawyer. Oh, you like the money. Oh, you know.
Of course.
Like, oh, my God, you know. So, yeah, I mean, it continues. And, of course, kind of, you know, let's briefly just outline your career. So you were an English teacher. From there.
So I started writing these things in my classroom. Philadelphia, the school district of Philadelphia was the first school district in the United States to have a curriculum on the Holocaust. And I was involved in the writing of that. And from there, I became sort of more connected to other like-minded teachers. My husband was on the first trip of the inaugural trip of an organization through the Jewish Labor Committee and the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors that we kind of then named the Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Teachers Program. It didn't really have a name in the beginning. And they went to Israel to study about the Holocaust. They chose my husband because of his involvement in what was then a Philadelphia institution called the Youth Symposium on the Holocaust. And he had been working with Catholic teachers and public school teachers to put together a day when students from all over the city could meet Holocaust survivors and have a chance to talk with them about their experiences. And it was just a blockbuster event for kids, life-changing. And then on the very first alumni reunion of that organization, I met the woman that was pivotal to changing my Holocaust life, and that was Vladka Meed.
Yep, me too.
Yeah, who had organized this trip, thinking that teachers were the best ambassadors for teaching about the Holocaust, but through a very particular lens, which was the idea of spiritual resistance. And even though I think we all kind of thought that in the back of our heads, we were fighting against that sort of old-fashioned notion the Jews went like sheep to the slaughter. And we needed to always talk about armed resistance or physical resistance of some kind, not realizing that the spiritual resistance, the dignity of everyday life, maintaining who you were, trying to teach your children about Judaism, helping other people to survive, that was the real strength of Jews during the Holocaust.
Yes.
And once that kind of sort of permeated me, I thought this is the way to go, and that's what pushed me forward.
And that's what you've done since then.
So
and of course, for our audience, Elaine and I met on that 1988 trip going to Israel to study Jewish resistance and the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
And that also was a huge life-changing moment for me in becoming a Holocaust educator.
Most definitely. Not only was she an inspirational leader, but she was a visionary in terms of really thinking this through from a different perspective. And then I was just very lucky that she anointed me her successor. And the responsibility, and I will say a major responsibility, at times a real burden to push this forward, which I did for many years afterwards.
Yes. So, yeah, really, what a woman. So, and I carry her with me and speak about her often. So let's just fast forward to 2026. In 1988, when we met and I launched, this, and this was part of your, I don't think that we thought that the world would be where it is today, ever. And if anything, our work is that much more important, that much, the same stereotypes, conspiracy theories, scapegoating, all of this stuff about Jews and is out there in full force, I think worse than ever.
Much worse.
Yeah. What are some of your words of wisdom, or maybe words to give hope to people? I know it's a hard one.
That is a hard one. I'd like to be Pollyanna here and say everything is going to be all right, but I don't know that that's the case. I think we're up against forces that most of us are not quite sure how to counter. And that is all of the internet hate, all of the popularity of certain kinds of symbols, thoughts, and ideas that kids are inundated with, and that they believe because the stuff that's being put out there is being put out there so professionally and so provocatively that it's very hard to resist it and not believe it. And we as Jews, I think, are particularly vulnerable because even though people will say, I don't really believe that Jews are, and you can fill in the blank here, they will still respond in ways that indicate that there is a kernel of something that they're acting upon.
Right.
So if we say the Jews are in charge of Hollywood, or no Jews died in 9/11, all of these kinds of ridiculous things, I would like to think that Jews are powerful, but if we were so powerful, we wouldn't be worried about anti-Semitism.
Well, I say that all the time when I give tours. I say to the kids, well, if the Jews really did control the media, then you have to be honest, they're doing a really lousy job, aren't they?
That, and the power of the world.
Yes.
If we're so manipulative in the power of the world, why are we being so easily hurt? So easily attacked, so much the center of controversy around every political action. Sometimes I think chosen people, chosen for what?
Right. Yeah, I know. It's really hard. It really is hard. But again, we will continue to do what we do, and having your book published and relating your feelings and thoughts and your mother's story is one way of getting the word out there. So people need to be educated, and they need to read, and we need to keep putting it in their face. And that's not the only, but it's one of the major ways that we can counter a lot of this.
So something that I would say, just sort of to tie this all together, is that my mother's story was not only a survivor's story, but an immigrant story. And my story is daughter of immigrants with this extra added layer of the kind of trauma that my parents experienced when they were teens, and that gets passed on. And we know now that this kind of trauma gets passed on through your genes. So it's inside of you, and that they're now looking at third generation folks and seeing that there is something there as well, actual physical changes as a result. So having been born 2 months after my parents came to America, there's no surprise here that this was a pivotal event at which I was not present, but which has changed my life.
Yes. Well, thank you for everything, for being who you are, for being the resilient, strong professional woman that you are, and for sharing your story, because it's not easy. And you're making yourself very vulnerable by doing that. And I applaud that, and I understand that sometimes that is the way into kids. We have to show them vulnerability for them to see us as real people.
I agree. And to take away the idea of everybody was a hero, but to allow people to just be human, I think is an important thing. Only human, just like you who's reading the book.
Exactly. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
As always. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our podcast and watching our podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Legacy Chronicles. Donna Rosenblum.